The royal tombs of the New Kingdom appear to be models of the Netherworld. We actually know this because the architecture of the tombs matches the architecture of the Netherworld in the Book of the Hidden Chamber, the text that we often refer to as the Amduat. So on the walls of some of the tombs are a type of illustrated religious text prototype for the very architecture of those tombs.
When we think about Egyptian funerary texts, I think most people think about the Book of the Dead, which the ancient Egyptians called the Book of Going Forth by Day. But there's a whole additional tradition that we have to talk about that culminates in the New Kingdom royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. So it actually starts as early as the 5th dynasty. The final king of the 5th dynasty, a king named Unas, is the first king to have pyramid texts. So to have spells and rituals written down inside his burial chamber. And then those pyramid texts, many of them continue into the coffin texts, which then continue into the Book of the Dead with additional spells added. But the Netherworld books are an entirely separate tradition.
So you can't really say that the pyramid texts become the coffin texts, become the Book of the Dead, although some spells actually do that.
It's like new ones come in as we go.
So new ones come in and some stay the same. This kind of architecture and text relating, that there being a significance not just of what a text says, but where the text says it.
And that's why reading text out of books can be somewhat misleading, because those texts in a book on the pages are in 3 dimensions in the original monument. So getting to see what they look like and some of the amazing 3D models that are being made available now through the Ministry of Antiquities in Egypt, you get a sense to be there. You get a sense of what it's like to be surrounded by these texts in a larger architectural setting.
Another interesting thing to point out is that there isn't an idea that there is a single, there's a book of the pyramid text and that's it, because each pyramid has a slightly different grouping, and additional text may come in, and some text may not appear again or may not appear in that particular monument.
And when we look at the Netherworld books, that becomes overwhelmingly significant, because the Book of Amduat, you will also hear about the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Book of the Earth, also known as Creation of the Solar Disk. All of these texts describe the same 12 hours of the night, but in radically different ways. There are overlaps, particularly Amduat and Gates, but there's also these huge divergences. And for the Egyptians, it's not as if one is right, one is wrong, one is from one place, one is from one group of priests, but they take a multiplicity of approaches when thinking about something that is by its very nature the beyond.
And the interesting thing about the Netherworld books is that although they are concerned with the Duat, although they are concerned with the nocturnal journey of the sun, they are in many ways primarily a solar text, and they revolve frequently, if not exclusively, some of them, around this concept of reconciliation of life and death, the joining of the god Osiris, who is equated with yesterday, and the god Re, who is tomorrow, the male-female elements of the solar disk, the Iten as the male, the Chat, the corpse, the horizon, the Achet as the female elements, this reconciliation of cosmic opposites to achieve a Ma'at that brings about rebirth. A number of the royal tombs have been open really since the end of the New Kingdom, apparently. During the Greco-Roman period, when a lot of visitors came to Egypt, it became a tourist attraction, the tombs were visited. There are a number of Greco-Roman graffiti in the tombs. And the Greek term for a tomb in the Valley of the Kings was syrinx, like a flute. Long tube going into the mountainside. The Greeks named Egyptian things rather odd terms sometimes, like obelisk, the sky-piercing techen is called in Greek obelisk, meaning a meat skewer, a roasting spit, like a shish kebab stick or something.
I love this idea of Greco-Roman tourists, and we know that there were guides that local Egyptian priests would give tours of ancient Egyptian monuments. Herodotus in his histories records talking to priests and getting tours of ancient sites. So just how tourists today visit the Valley of the Kings, in Greek times and Roman times, visitors would have gone. And unfortunately, this idea of graffitiizing of adding your name to an ancient monument has a multi-thousand-year history.
In the Greco-Roman period, the tomb of Ramesses VI seems to have been one of the more popular places to visit. And it was actually known as the tomb of metempsychosis, as though there was a concept of wandering of the soul in ancient Egypt, as though there were possibly even some concept of reincarnation. That doesn't really seem to come out of the Egyptian texts as such, but the tombs did receive names. So Ramesses VI's tomb, for instance, is treated in some texts, I believe, as the tomb of Memnon. And all of the West Bank would even be called the Memnonia, the realm of Memnon, possibly based on epithets of some of the rulers as Meriamun, beloved of Amun.
That's fascinating. And the two really famous statues of Amunhotep III, the Colossi, often erroneously called the Colossi of Memnon.
There's only one Colossus of Memnon.
Exactly. Only one. Only the North Colossus was actually Memnon. So both of the Colossi were in front of the mortuary temple of Amunhotep III, who had a golden age in his 38-year reign, although his tomb in the Valley of the Kings is fairly rarely visited because it was in the West Valley.
So this idea of a sacred statue is interesting because although in the Greco-Roman period, the northern Colossus of Amenhotep III was called Memnon, the leader of the Ethiopian contingent fighting for the Trojans. Even though the northern statue is the divine image in the Greco-Roman period, we know from inscriptions on the backs of the Colossus, of the southern Colossus, that the southern statue, when erected in the reign of Amenhotep III, the southern statue has its own name and is a divinity in its own right, by whom the king himself may be said to be beloved.
And this brings up a really interesting ancient Egyptian practice, which is the ritual of the opening of the mouth. This is something that we see in the New Kingdom royal tombs. It is certainly something that we see in private tombs. And you could perform the ritual of opening the mouth both on the mummy, which is how we traditionally think about it, as well as a statue. So for the Egyptians, doing this ritual of the adze that's being touched to the mouth of either the statue or the mummy, that enables the mummy or the statue to receive the spirit of the deceased or the spirit of the reigning king. This goes to the heart of ancient Egyptian practice, that an image, a representation of a person or a king or a god could receive the divine spirit. When you walk into an ancient Egyptian royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, you go through a series of descending passageways. And the architecture beyond that can incorporate the angle change that we see in the 18th dynasty, or simply a jog in this series of descending corridors. And the very first corridor is called the Path of Shu. Now, Shu is the god of light and space. We could even say the god of luminous space, and he is the god who stands between Geb, a god who can personify the earth, and Nut, a goddess who can personify the sky. And remember that these tombs would have only been visited during the actual funerary ceremonies, as well as by Medjoi, who patrolled the Valley of the Kings and checked to make sure that nothing had been disturbed in the tombs. But otherwise, they were sealed. The rituals, the ceremonies, those were taking place in the mortuary temple. But at the same time, those first two corridors of the pathway of Shu are where we see representations of the forms of the sun in a text that we call the Book of Re in the West, or commonly called the Litany of Re. The first is the ancient title, the other is the conventional modern title. The
Netherworld books, as we call them, that adorn the walls of primarily the royal tombs of the New Kingdom, although they occur elsewhere and later as well. These texts we call the Netherworld books begin to appear around the time of Hatshepsut, Thutmose III.
She's a great innovator.
She does seem to be. We have blocks associated with one of the burials of Thutmose I that have the Book of Amduat on them, the Book of the Hidden Chamber.
And then we also see both the Book of the Hidden Chamber and the Book of Re in the West in the tomb of Usur-Amun, Thutmose III's vizier, which is one of the very few times we see it in a private tomb.
And it's interesting that the Book of the Hidden Chamber contains directions as to how it is to be laid out on a wall. And it also contains some instructions as to how to lay out apparently this index that appears along with it. So it's a rather interesting composition. We don't really know the origins of these texts. Some people have tried to push them back much farther than their earliest occurrences. Others assume they probably date to just about the time of the earliest occurrence. Grammatically, it doesn't seem likely that they existed in their present form prior to the Middle Kingdom.
And this is an important point as well, that when we think about funerary texts in ancient Egypt, most people would think Book of the Dead. That's the classic, the papyrus scrolls with various spells showing you how to pass the gates, transform into a scarab, go through the judgment hall, chapter 125, where your heart is weighed against the feather of truth, against Ma'at. But that's a separate tradition from the Netherworld books. So the Book of the Dead can occur in New Kingdom royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, but it's a much smaller percentage of the wall space, right?
It tends to be.
Books.
I mean, interestingly, on the second shrine of Tutankhamun, that contains one of the three versions of a cryptographic Netherworld book that revolves around this concept of the union of Re and Osiris, we get a mixture of cryptographic Netherworld text and Book of the Dead passages.
So there aren't just hieroglyphs, there are cryptographic hieroglyphs.
Right, and we'll talk about that later.